Welcome to Behind the Build. I'm your host, Jonathan Jacobs, and today I have with me Heather Dubbeldam from Dubbeldam Architecture and Design. Heather, thank you for taking time out of what has been, I know, very, very busy schedule this year to discuss your practice and all that it encompasses.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I'll start things off with what has been, I think, probably one of the biggest game-changing things for your practice so far that was announced earlier this year, and that is the 2024 Practice of the Year with the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much.
And how has that changed the practice?
Well, I think it raised a little more awareness for our practice. And one of the reasons that we were recognized was all the advocacy work that we do outside of the business of architecture. So I think that not everyone knew about all the different initiatives that we were involved with. And it was, nice for people to find out what's going on behind the scenes.
And so what are some of those initiatives? Because I know that there's a long list of them. So what are they? Let's say multi-res, or where would you like to take it?
In terms of the advocacy, there's a number of different advocacy initiatives that are kind of woven into our practice. And some of them are kind of an extension of the work that we do. They involve things like diversity and inclusion for architects, promoting the next generation of architects in the profession, helping improve things in the built environment. So if I started to get into a few of them, 20 and Change is one that's going on right now. And that's an initiative that helps to promote emerging Canadian architects. So firms that have less than 10 to up to 10 years of practice under their belt. Mm-hmm. It's very tough to be emerging architecture practice. And especially, I think, in Canada, we're quite spread out and there's not a lot of awareness around architecture. So this program helps to raise awareness about a new group of practices every 3 years. And we have partnered with Canadian Architect Magazine, who do a special issue of the magazine. And this year it's going to be in October, featuring 20 practices. So we had a curatorial committee of architects and educators from around the country. There was 6 of us all together, including Elsa Lam, who is the editor of Canadian Architect Magazine, Ben Klumper from MODA Architecture in Calgary, who actually just won the Professional Prix de Rome in architecture for this year, for 2024.
Congratulations.
He's really killing it right now. And Andrew Hill from Studio AC in Toronto.
Yep.
And Marie Chantal Croft from Eco Bâtiment in Quebec City, and Susan Fitzgerald from FBM in Halifax. So we came together and spent, 2 sessions, several hours reviewing all the submissions that we received, and we've selected 20 different practices that we're going to be announcing later this year. And we find that this is a real boost for those practices to get the awareness that maybe they hadn't had previously.
Right.
I was actually an emerging practice at one point, and I remember how difficult it was. And we were featured in the very first iteration of 20 and Change, which was more of a Toronto focus. Right. And then since then, I took over the initiative and turned it into a national program. So we're on our 6th iteration this year. And
this is, and you said every 3 years.
It's about every 3 years, yeah. Yeah, the last one we did was 2021.
So that's pretty extensive to be able to then, you're drawing upon all the principles from across the country to be able to understand who's in your city, what they're doing, and what is the criterion for the people that are involved in this?
So to be selected, we were looking for practices that, as I mentioned, 10 years or less, but also who were either practicing architecture in a slightly different way, a different model of practice, who were trying to change something in their work. So the focus was on the plus change. Yeah. So 20 is usually we have around 20. So maybe it's 19, maybe it's 22. This year it's 20. And it's really focused on the change. So innovation. And innovation is really a term that's tossed around a lot. It's a big word. But really, we were just talking about change practices that are looking at sustainable architecture in a different way, practices that we're looking at a different model for making buildings. So collaborating with builders directly, definitely focused on sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And outside of that, I know that there are a number of other initiatives that you're highly involved with.
Yeah, a few of them. I'm the chair of the advisory committee for BEAT, which is Building Equality in Architecture Toronto.
Yep.
It's an organization that helps to support and elevate women in the profession of architecture. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, it's been a little harder for women in our profession. I think that's definitely improving.
Yeah.
And
male-dominated industry.
The industry is very male-dominated. On the architecture side, there's more and more women. On the engineering side, we're starting to see more women, but it's still fairly heavy with men. And obviously, the construction industry is very male-dominated.
Yeah.
So just getting more women involved in the construction industry in general is a very good thing. Having any kind of diversity in the groups of people who are contributing to the built environment will just make a better built environment in every possible way. So we are a networking and mentorship organization. We host a lot of different events to connect people. We're supporting the younger generation of women coming into the profession. There's opportunities for more senior architects, and it's not actually exclusive to women, but the focus is on supporting women. So another advocacy initiative that we're involved with is Parking Day.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that is actually a global movement that was started in 2005 by an architecture practice in San Francisco, and it's to raise awareness about our public space. So it's a movement that for one weekend in September, actually the third weekend in September, people temporarily convert parking spaces into pop-up parks. So it's to raise awareness about creating more public space and open space for people as our cities densify. And it's grown to this huge movement around the world. I think there's about 35 different countries involved now, 350 cities.
Wow.
At one point, at its height.
Yeah.
So we took on the coordination of Parking Day Toronto 3 years ago,
Okay.
and trying to stimulate this movement in Toronto. And the first year, I think we only had about 3 or 4 installations. Last year, we had a few more, and we decided to try to expand the program this year. So we reached out to a few other practices in Toronto to see if we could establish a partnership to look at a grants program. So we could offer grants to different groups who want to put together an installation. Sometimes cost can be a prohibitive factor.
Of course.
In terms of being able to build something or buy materials. And oftentimes it's students or recent grads who look at putting together these kind of activations.
Right.
So we're partnering with SVN, with DTAH and ARUP to pool some resources and some money to offer grants. So we're just about to make an announcement, I think in the next week or two, about this program, about the granting program, and try and get, stimulate more activations around the city.
And are you utilizing the network that you each have to be able to have people donate towards the grant? Is that how this?
Well, at this point, we're all just pitching in.
You are? Okay.
Initially. And then we'll see if it grows from there, but we'll see how much interest there is in terms of uptake.
Yeah.
So I guess a good example would be winter stations and how they've grown that program. Mm-hmm. It's turned out to be this amazing thing every year. They get so many submissions. Actually, some of them come from around the world. And in this case, Parking Day would be more local, right, obviously, because people are going to be building something. So all the people from their offices have already agreed to do their own activation and turn their parking lot or some parking spaces outside their office into pop-up parks.
Right.
And then we have a few other groups who are interested as well. So the movement is gaining traction. We still have a few months before.
This is an opportunity for anyone out there that is as a trader or supplier to be able to consider doing something philanthropic. And you could probably reach out to Heather or Kevin at Dubbeldam if you want to donate any of your leftover funds.
Or even lend some materials.
Yeah.
If there's something. For example, when we did it the first year, we borrowed AstroTurf from an organization called Lazy Lawn. So they lent us this gigantic piece of AstroTurf that covered 2 parking spaces. Oriole Landscaping donated a whole bunch of plants, shrubs and things in containers that they brought. We set it all up. We created all these different like mini rooms within these parking spaces.
Amazing.
And then they came and picked them up afterwards. Like they were able to reuse them.
Yeah.
Like the key thing is that nothing gets wasted or thrown out.
Right.
So, and also Urban Mode, the furniture company, lent us a whole bunch of furniture. So we were able to create this huge activation. So that's another way that different companies can get involved in terms of lending furniture or plants or if there's leftover building materials from construction sites, because a lot of the installations around the world involve building a small, structure, benches. It's nice to see the creativity that comes out through the process as well.
Right, or community involvement. I'm wondering if any of these places need hands to help construct, right? So perhaps a labor force of some kind might be useful.
You're giving me a lot of ideas, actually, because we're just drafting the terms of reference right now. So
there's a lot of trades out there that we work with that are worth connecting with, because sometimes people need to work on certain hours to retain their apprenticeship. Right.
Yeah. Or they were just interested in getting involved in something fun that's different from their day job.
Yeah. High school students, they need their time. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So
third weekend in September.
So there it is. Take note.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a lot of advocacy, a lot of different programs that you're affiliated with. And I know that you also are involved with providing lectures at different schools across the country. So, I mean, I'm curious myself, that's a lot. So how do you manage all of this? How do you coordinate your time between all of these incredible initiatives and then the dedication to staff and family? Like, how does that work? What does your calendar look like?
Not enough sleep. Yeah, no, it's a lot of this stuff has to happen after hours, right?
Right.
So during the day it's focused on projects and client work. And then in the evenings and weekends is when I kind of do the fun stuff.
And so how did all of this evolve? I would like to say, can we start from the beginning? Like, you're doing all of these things now. At what point did you know you wanted to become an architect? How old were you?
Well, my father is an architect, and his father and his father. So it's kind of something that runs in the family. Mm-hmm. I knew about that when I was young. And I guess the turning point was when I was 16 and my parents sat me down and had a big conversation about my future. And I think 16 is a little young because at the time we had grade 13. So there was still a few more years of high school.
Yeah, OAC.
You're really good at math and you're really good at science and you're great at art and you should be an architect. I'm like, okay, sounds good. And when you're 16, you don't really understand all the other possibilities. But my father was a wonderful mentor and role model. And he was involved with a lot of different types of projects around the world. He was more on the kind of larger scale, more on the planning side actually than on making buildings at the smaller scale. But every house we ever lived in, he renovated himself, and I was always involved with that sort of thing. So being involved with building at a young age, obviously I wasn't like physically constructing at age 5, but I was kind of fooling around with building materials. And so my whole life has been, growing up with going to see buildings when we traveled and going to always cultural institutions, museums and galleries. My mother studied landscape architecture as a mature student. Actually, while I was going through architecture school, she studied landscape architecture. And so I was really immersed in the kind of the landscape side of things. Every time we would go for a walk, she would point out every single tree or plant and give me the Latin name because she was studying this stuff. And I don't remember a single one of the Latin names, obviously, but I learned a lot about landscaping and plant material and how to utilize it as a way to support architecture.
Right.
And how landscaping and plant material isn't just something you can appreciate in the summer, how to bring those elements as a design feature to a project that give it visual interest year round.
Right.
So that was sort of a big part of how I grew up. But it was a total immersion in architecture. And I guess I didn't appreciate that until I decided to step away from the profession. At times, things can be very demanding in our profession, and I felt like I needed a break from doing the things that I was doing at that time. And so I started taking on different types of commissions related to other design fields like furniture design and millwork and graphic design. I was doing a whole bunch of work on the graphics side and a lot of photography. So I was working professionally as a photographer, doing portraits, shooting other architects' buildings, shooting product. And all of that was a huge counterpoint to architecture, which takes so long to start from the beginning of a project and see it all the way through to when the building is constructed, especially because I was working for a large practice and the projects were very large. So the minimum time frame is 3 years.
Right.
At that time, it was more like 5 years or longer. And it was so nice to be working on different creative pursuits that were more immediate. So photography, you take a picture, I would go in the darkroom, I would develop it and be done. So the turnaround time was, could be a few hours.
The pressure's different, right?
Totally different. And I guess once you get into anything really actively, there are all different kinds of pressures in any field. But I started to find that I wasn't as fulfilled working on all those other design related activities as I was doing architecture because of the spatial aspect, actually creating spaces for people. The built environment is really where my heart was. So I ended up starting my own practice, architecture practice, and the impact on the built environment in every way, whether it was just an interior or something that was more significant, was definitely more rewarding. And I questioned that so many times in terms of, am I doing the right thing with all of my time? You invest a lot of time when you're an architect in what you do. There's a lot of passion, but I know that because every time I go on a job site, on a construction site, I love everything about it. I love the smell of curing concrete and the sawdust when wood is being cut. And probably some of those things could be a little toxic, but I still love the smells of those things. And just seeing, even in the demolition stage, but definitely under the construction side when things are being built and seeing the space being formed and how do the proportions work out the way we plan them. Is the ceiling the right height? Is the room the right width? And then of course getting into the details and all the proportions of all the kind of finer details. And I absolutely love that side of things. So it made me realize that I was in the right field after all. But I did try and remake how I organized my time and try to build a practice that was focused on work-life balance. And that's something that I've talked about in different contexts, different forums before. It's hard to actually use the word balance because, in anything you do, there never is going to be a perfect balance.
No.
And so it's a bit of a fallacy to talk about work-life balance. It's all very personal. Everybody's own situation is so different. What works for one person is so different for someone else. And so someone who is a workaholic who absolutely loves what they do, which I guess you could call me that, and I work a lot of hours, but I get a lot of satisfaction from that. It fuels me versus someone else who can't or doesn't want to work like that. And so everybody has to find their own equilibrium. And I did a talk last year for BEAT actually, and addressed a room full of young women and talked a little bit about how to find your own position that works for you and how that will evolve. Every year it'll be different at different stages in your career and your life. It'll be different whether you have a family or not. And then when you get older, the pressures of caring for parents and all these different aspects of life that are connected because it's not work versus life, right? It's like work-life balance. There's no real difference. It's all life. Work, if you're an architect too, it's a real passion, and it isn't just work. It's really who you are, and it's connected to everything you do. It's the way you see the world, really. So they bleed into each other, and there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean you have to work crazy hours, but it's nothing wrong with your vocation or your profession bleeding like back and forth with life. So I don't know if I'm describing it really well or not. But
I think you are. Well, because part of what you just talked about is built environment, right? And you know, your passion for all of this, it is what we, the non-architect, get to experience, right? You're designing what we get to experience. And I don't think anyone who says, oh, I understand, can ever actually understand what it is to be an architect. I don't have the education. I don't have any of the upbringing. I didn't have generations of people ahead of me that were leading me down that path. I don't think anyone can understand that. What do you think are some of the misconceptions of what it is to be an architect? And what do you think are some of the strongest points of being an architect that you get to exude in what you do?
That's a good question. I think a lot of people don't really understand what architects do.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's a profession that everybody sees the end result. I mean, they're walking down the street and they can see the buildings, but they don't really understand what's involved with making those buildings. And I think something like being an interior designer is so much easier to understand because they design the interiors of a building. But there really is no distinction for architects because a building is the same thing, whether it's the inside or out. So we basically design every element of a building. I think one of the fallacies is that architects just design the outside or the envelope, we call it, the walls and the roof and the floors. But everything that you see and touch in a building is designed. Well, everything out there in the built environment is designed. And actually, that's one of the ways I've been describing it lately is that there's so many touch points in people's lives in terms of the built environment. And I think that it can provide joy or frustration depending on the context. So if you think about your own, your day, you wake up in the morning, likely in a home, whether that's an apartment or condominium or a house. So that's part of the built environment. You have to walk down the street to get to office or school or wherever you're going. So, streets, public transportation, bridges, every part of an interior in your school, in your office, everything. It's all built environment. And there are things that can make it more efficient and more pleasurable. And there's things that can make it more frustrating. So what we do as architects is not just about the individual buildings. It's about how those individual buildings have an impact on the built environment, the street. We as architects have the ability to really positively influence everything around just the individual buildings that we're designing. And of course, have such a huge impact on people's lives, not just in terms of efficiency and experience, but also wellness.
Yeah.
How much natural light is in a space, being able to utilize natural ventilation, creating spaces that, like I said, have a positive impact in many different ways, including making you feel joy when you're there, some inspiring feeling. So that's really what we're aiming to do, I think.
It's interesting because as I've gone through this kind of conversation with a lot of people, as you're describing this, one of the things that I really find is that everything that an architect does touches on all of the senses without people
except maybe
knowing.
Taste.
I mean, if it's not
Unless
designed well and you have mold inside, you're probably going to taste it.
True. Yeah, that's true.
But and it connects beyond those five all of your senses, right?
Yeah.
And that's not to reference a interesting movie, Sixth Sense, but the Sixth Sense being the feeling.
Yeah.
Right. And when you're walking, to your point, along the street and you walk along and something is designed well and invites you in, there's a lot of thought that went into that. And there was a stamp. There was a stamp associated with your name on everything.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of weight to that. You get to take what you do and completely change the landscape of a city.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
It's a lot of responsibility.
It's a heavy responsibility.
Yeah.
So I can appreciate in whatever way I can the requirement that you felt at one stage to be able to go and take photographs because it's heavy.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
And then you come back into it re-energized, and now here you are and you're involved in all of these different advocacy groups. And you talked to me before about how you have a connection to a lot of the female architects in the city, mm-hmm. and the exchanging of ideas that happen between you, and so you create an environment of collaboration. I apologize for ranting right now, but I'm just trying to summarize some of the beauty of what the career has been so far, and the importance of what it has been so far to not just yourself and your staff and the people that have lived or work inside of some of the spaces you've designed, but also to those that don't know. There's a lot there.
Yeah. I guess one of the reasons that I'm doing all these things is I would really want to have some positive impact. And there's so many different ways to do that, I guess. But for me, the practice of architecture isn't just about getting a client and making a building for them. There's so much more potential beyond that. And advocacy is one way that I realize that potential. And also it's stimulating, getting involved with all these different things and different groups of people, and definitely helping elevate other people. I think that helping elevate the emerging practices in Canada is a big thing that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, I just found it so challenging when I was starting out, and it was a different time. It was 22 years ago now, I guess, or almost 21 years ago. And
it's daunting.
Well, back then, things were really different. There was no social media. The web was nascent, and we still used fax machines in terms of communicating.
Instagram and TikTok and all the social media that exists. Nothing.
There wasn't the same level of ability to reach people as there is today. So it's easy for young practices to really get their work out there. But there are so many more practices now.
Right.
So in terms of having impact and reaching people. So also in Canada, I find that, as I mentioned, we're such a large country, and it's so regionally based. Everything is so spread out. 20 Change is a great way to connect the different regions and connect the young architects with more established firms from across the country. But I think partially because everything's so spread out, we don't have as much there's not a lot of awareness about what we're doing in Canada outside of Canada. So I think this is another way to help boost Canadian architecture and get it, on the world stage, which we need to do. We're doing a lot of really interesting things here in Canada. I was talking to an architect last night, and I was at an event, and she's not originally from Canada. She moved here about 8 years ago.
Okay.
And she has been traveling recently for work. And every time she comes back, she said, it's just so amazing to be back here. We're so progressive compared to so many other places in the world. And that surprised me, because I always look to Europe and think of how progressive they are as far as the built environment goes and everything else. And she said, no, in terms of diversity and people and respect, in terms of how we respect different voices and different viewpoints compared to other places. And we're doing so much in terms of reconciliation, in terms of diversity and inclusion compared to other places. And so that kind of struck me as something that's definitely worth recognizing. But then focusing on the architecture side, all these things are connected. Right? Because we are making buildings for people, and the more diverse voices that we have in that process, we're only going to end up with better buildings and a better built environment.
And so I know that another one of the big advocacy things that you're involved with and you're really keen on is about density in the city. And for those that don't know, Toronto is one of the largest metropolises in all of North America, and there's a strong push for density in the city. So I know that, and you were saying before when we were chatting prior to the starting of the recording, that large portion of your work is now has moved in that direction. So what does that look like for the practice and what you're trying to fulfill for the requirements in the city?
Well, we started doing what we're calling design research, which research is more kind of looking things up and writing reports. Design research is when you start to design prototypes and solutions for things without any client, or sometimes not even a site, just trying to figure out way to solve problems. So the problem in Toronto is that, everyone knows we have a housing crisis. There's not enough places for people to live. Affordability is a huge aspect. Yeah. It's definitely a problem across the country, but it's much worse in Toronto and the cities like Vancouver as well. So we were just, everyone's been talking about Toronto in terms of the form how all the neighborhoods are really low density. One of the city's strategies is to take all the public transit nodes and sort of build higher density. That's been going on for quite some time. So we're seeing really tall buildings happening on corners, and then like really low density in neighborhoods. So there's been a lot of recent activity trying to figure out another way, looking at mid-rise, looking at missing middle. I think everybody knows what missing middle is, but just trying to find solutions that are in between a single family home and a high-rise tower. So I guess anything between single family and mid-rise being 6 stories and up. So that might mean duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, small apartment buildings, but the kinds of housing that they call gentle, quote unquote, that can be woven into neighborhoods while still maintaining the quality of those neighborhoods that people love, which isn't having really high scale buildings. So that's going to, one aspect is the whole missing middle side, and I'll kind of come back to that in a minute. Yeah. But then on our major streets, we have so many in Toronto that have 2-story single family houses. They're on bus routes or streetcar routes. They're very, very busy streets with 4 or 6 lanes of traffic. Yeah. And all of those could be built up to a much higher density and fit more people, more units, I guess. Sometimes we call them families, but not all of them are family units, just, residential units. Yeah. On one of those sites. So we had started looking, this is maybe 4 or 5 years ago, or actually it was pre-COVID, so let's say 5 or 6 years ago, we started looking at ways to take, we lost like a few years there in the middle, ways of taking those properties that really should have higher density on main streets served by public transportation, and looking at, how high can we go on those streets, looking at the proportion, the width of the street, how many vehicles could go there, what sort of sidewalk width do you need? And then we started designing these like very provocative 6-story, very narrow dwellings that have like at least 10 units in them, and retail are great because you can't just build a whole bunch of housing and not have the support systems, the laundromats, the corner store, your little bike shop, and places for people to buy food. So you need all of that as well, and to try and build on the idea of the 15-minute city, so not everyone has to drive to the grocery store. You can just pop over to the next street over and grab a little bit of food like they do in Europe on their way home from work, right?
I've never heard that term before, the 15-minute city.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I like
that. So
I
better explain it a little bit. Well, it turned out to be kind of a controversial term during COVID because it was misunderstood. But the idea is that within a 50-minute walk of where you live, you could get almost everything you need.
Right.
So I live here close to St. Clair and Dufferin, a little bit further east. And within 15 minutes, I can walk to pick up, vegetables and fruit at the corner store. We happen to have about 6 bakeries within walking distance of my house.
It's a requirement.
The LCBO, very important. All the things like the Shoppers Drug Mart, all the different things that you need are within 15 minutes, but also a school, a community center, a gym, all the things that form part of your sort of life activities. Right?
And where we are lacking right now in the city.
Well, and depends where you live, because where I live, I can get everything I need within 15 minutes. And the only time that we drive is if we have to do a big grocery shop. You could ride your bike actually and do that sort of thing. So building on the 15-minute city, if you can develop more of those amenity spaces, retail and commercial spaces within neighborhoods, on the edge of neighborhoods, let's say on the major streets, then everyone can just pop over and grab things very quickly. It's a very European model. Yeah. A few times I had the opportunity to live or work overseas for extended periods, either when I was in school or when I graduated. And on your way home from work, you stop in at all the little shops and just get the food you need for dinner and make dinner, or for 2 days or whatever. People don't tend not to drive out to the Costco and do like 2-week shop. Everything is just on your way home from work. Right. So it's building on that notion. So back to the schemes, we were looking at these sort of 6-story narrow buildings, but with 2 units per floor, and exploring having a single exit fire exit, because right now it doesn't matter the scale of the building, you need 2 fire exits. But when you only have 2 units per floor, there's less of a safety issue. And the biggest part of these schemes that we were exploring was how to make them more livable. So as our cities are densifying, other than the thing we were talking about earlier, parking day and more open space and parks for people, having the ability to have access to outdoor space really close to or attached to where you live. So if you're living on the 5th floor or 6th floor, it's not just a little narrow balcony where you can barely squeeze a chair on the table. How do you give people access to either private or shared outdoor space? I think that's a big part of livability. So we started looking at how do you define what is livable when it comes to multi-unit dwelling. And through that research, we were invited to exhibit at the Venice Biennale last year, along with 8 other women-led practices from around the world who were focusing on livability in multi-unit housing. So that was really the focus of the exhibition. And so from there, we started looking at, okay, how do you roll this out even further?
I have to describe what I see right now. And that is that right now, as you're talking about solving these problems with the other people, a smile just went across your face because you just started remembering what this was like.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the passion about doing what you do. Yeah. I don't mean to have disrupted your train of thought, but to me, it's important for people to understand what this dialogue is. And there's a human behind all of this, and it's nice. Well, it's nice to see. I just like it.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. But I think the other reason I was smiling is that things are changing in the city, and they're getting better. And it was a few weeks ago that council decided that they passed a motion to allow up to 6-story buildings on main streets, on major streets in Toronto. Streets like Dufferin or Ossington, where there's a lot of traffic, like I said, served by public transportation, and they're on the edges of neighborhoods. So neighborhoods are the kind of inner residential streets. And so all the work that we have been doing, exploring all these different ways of developing that density, all of a sudden became even more relevant. And so we did a post that day on Instagram and LinkedIn with one of the schemes that we had designed. And we've rendered them all so they kind of almost look like real buildings. And of course, got a huge reaction, mostly positive. And a few people are like, oh, that's so incongruous with the other 2-story houses on the street. And I said, well, that's exactly the point. Now that 6 stories is allowed, you're going to start seeing them being built everywhere in the city, which is what we need. The length of time that it takes to assemble a whole series of properties and build a 40-story tower, that's a long period of time. But if you can take a single property that's, say, 25 feet wide by 100 to 130 feet long, and have 10 residential units on it in a way that, is actually very livable. They're not crammed in there, and they actually have a lot of windows that can open, have natural ventilation and outdoor space to access. Like that would be amazing. Yeah. So then the question is, how do you actually roll it out across all these streets? So we had a student from U of T working with us for the last 6 weeks. There's a program that U of T has called the DRIP program, which is research and practice. They basically have a student come into your practice, and then the student is already interested in a certain line of research, and that's building on the research that we're doing. So the student that we had, Noor, she was taking all the ideas that we established even further. So let's look at it at a context of a block, and then the next block, and what impact does that have in terms of shadows on the neighborhood and air movement, and then how do you find the right proportion for the sidewalks? Can we look at integrating bike lanes in a different way? Can we look at boulevards with trees? How do you still allow for emergency services to, if when you're reducing the amount of lanes of traffic, to still function properly? And I mean, this is beyond architecture now. We're talking
I was going to say, but this goes back to what you said before about what do architects do? Yeah, and the lack of values, and sometimes when we talk about this, and you're talking about, and sometimes you're doing this studies of the sun and how the sun's going to move across property, but talking about the impact of wind and how's wind going to change based on our air. How's it going to change? Right?
Yeah, it changes a lot when you start to introduce tall buildings.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at all of these major transit nodes, and even St. Clair and Bathurst is one example, it's created a bit of a wind tunnel there because there's a very tall building. It changes the dynamics. So architects understand this, and all the engineers that we work with, they understand this, and of course city builders understand this as well. But it's having more and more of an impact as you move around the city because the density is really increasing. So it's not just about okay, let's get more units. It's how do we design more units that are really livable? We have to be talking about quality, not just quantity. And then what impact does that have on the public realm, right? How does that affect people walking down the street if they can't actually get to the corner on a windy day because the winds are so strong? So there's so many different elements that as architects, we're not just thinking about what kind of brick we're using and how large are the windows and how does the stair function and the ceiling heights. We're also thinking about what impact does the building have on the street. Aesthetics is only one teeny part of it, right? It's also the interaction of people with that space. It's about wind, light, air, shadows. All these different things are part of what we do. And I think that most architects really care about those things. Like they actually really care. We are often limited by different forces, like budget is one thing. Everybody wants to do the right thing, but oftentimes you have a challenge trying to,
money.
Costs have really escalated in the last few years. Yeah. Sometimes you're working for a client that doesn't understand the full impact of these things on the public realm. So we're always, hoping to be able to really explain the impact and really get them on board and have a positive influence. Trying to say all that in a really nice way. But there's a lot of different forces. Sometimes it's public opinion. They don't understand why we need so much density. So that element to me is what's so strange about all of this, because you have, and I had discussed this on another episode as well, and that is that when you look at the requirement for density, you have an entire generation multiple generations that have grown up in a city as dense as what Toronto is, but with a lack of homes. And you have an entire generation that's growing up right now that will not be able to afford it, as we've already discussed. And everyone wants more density in the city to make it more affordable, but nobody wants to give up what they have. Not everyone wants it. Everyone understands that we need it. That's fair. But some people don't want it. Recently heard a term that I thought was kind of funny. Who was it? Gil Penaloza, who was interviewed recently, and he said, yeah, when you start talking about making changes, you get all the cave people who come out. And then he paused and he explained what he meant by cave people. Stands for Citizens Against Virtually Everything. Not cave as in like Neanderthals, but people who just don't want to see change, right? And it's understandable in some ways. They love where they live. They like things the way they are. Change is hard. Change is hard to so many people, but we don't really have a choice. We have a lot of population growth in Canada, huge amount in Toronto. Of all of the people who come to Canada, a quarter of them end up in Toronto. So they're projecting that I think it's by 2050, Toronto will be 10 million people. So that requires a lot of housing. That's like a basic need above everything else. Everybody needs a place to live. So there's all different ways you can solve this problem. But right now it's a race to build more homes. And it's like a conversation about quantity. We need more. But there's no conversation about quality. So that's a huge thing that we're trying to talk about right now is like, what is livability? Do you consider that to be like an excess, something that's not important? No, it's like the most important thing. Like if we're all going to be living in a much denser city and with the majority of people living in multi-unit buildings, how do you make them so comfortable, beautiful, livable, like wonderful places for people to live and not a temporary thing? Oh yeah, I'm living here just for a few years and then eventually I'm going to buy a single family home with a backyard. And that's not a reality for so many people anymore. So how do you actually make all these units feel like they can call them their permanent home. And you just look at Europe for an example. There's in Scandinavia, we've done a whole bunch of research in Scandinavia on livability. It was really our whole research project started looking at environmental sustainability in Scandinavia because they are so far ahead of us in terms of environmental sustainability. And we wanted to understand how do architects there kind of seamlessly weave in all these sustainable principles into their buildings without compromising on design excellence. And when we started to do our field research there and meeting with architects and getting tours, none of them are talking about environmental sustainability because their standards are so high.
It's already interwoven into the way they're doing
interwoven into what they're doing. They don't even think about it anymore. Right. It was all about social sustainability. It was all about making the best places for people, engaging citizens. It was about creating spaces for people of all different levels of ability. Like when you start thinking about, young people, children and older people and everyone in between who isn't the most able person. So everything was about people. And so that had a huge impact on our work in terms of thinking about making these amazing spaces for people to live.
It's weighty. What you have just said is there was a lot of weight to it. You were talking about trying to completely alter the mindset of the cave people. Right? It's hard. It's hard to make people appreciate the fact that when they've been living in a house for 70 years, that maybe it's worth moving and finding something else or selling your place so that you can help provide to someone else. Part of what you talked about at the very beginning of this conversation was that you don't want it to be about you, right? You wanted this to be about the collective, the people of the city that we live in and beyond. I mean, I'll say this, but of the world. It's not about you. And I think that a lot of what you've discussed so far has been not about you. It has been about the importance of having an impact and a positive impact on the built environment for people.
Yeah.
And that resonates, I think, with everyone because everyone experiences it.
Yeah. And I think that sort of going back to people and change, I was just thinking about neighborhoods again. And I think I saw a lecture recently last month. It was an architect talking about infill in Calgary. And they're seeing a lot of inappropriately scaled and I hate this word, styled buildings, like buildings that look so incongruous with the neighborhood. They're seeing sort of the regular streetscape being transformed into something that's just a jumble of like all different styles and all different scales, and there's no coherency to it. Right. And so this architect was proposing solutions, looking at another way of doing this. So I was thinking about how in Toronto, an example of our neighborhoods. And so some of the work that we're doing, I was saying I was going to go back to the gentle density side of things. Mm-hmm. We're working on a number of schemes where a single family house is being replaced by a house that looks like the similar scale. So it could be a single family house, not that we should be valuing that above everything else, but that there's actually 8 units in there. And you can't tell because it fits in with the neighborhood, similar scale. We didn't have to go to the committee of adjustment for height. We actually stayed under the maximum height allowed. We're looking at peaked roofs that have a similar geometry to the rest of the street. But, behind the facade are, 8 units plus, say, a laneway suite or a garden suite in the back. And how to do that in a way that is actually cost effective, because there's a lot of small scale developers looking at this. Mm-hmm. And like I said before, livable with, not overbuilding for the lot. So we're working on a few of those right now. Actually, they're under construction.
Really? You're talking about solving a pretty challenging problem there, trying to figure out the design to be able to make that work.
Well, and the other thing is that right now you have to have two, as I mentioned, as soon as you have more than one, as soon as you get up to 3 stories, you have to have 2 exits,
right.
with all these units.
Right.
So how do you get around having the 2 exits without having to apply for an alternative solution at the building department, alternative solution to the building code?
Yeah.
So we managed to find different ways to get people up to those units. And it's a range of different size of units, from 1 bedroom, lots of 2 bedrooms, and then a few 3-bedroom units. Actually, some of them have 4-bedroom units in there. So this isn't necessarily for a large family, but often a group of students living together, or even recent graduates. And like people these days, when you graduate, you can't afford to rent an apartment in Toronto. It's just so expensive. So you have 2 friends living together, or 4 friends living together. So it's a different kind of model of multi-unit housing in neighborhoods. And we're also working on one down in the Grange neighborhood, which is near the AGO, across from the AGO, that whole neighborhood is basically downtown and is all really low density. So the city's been looking at that neighborhood for quite some time to figure out, like, how do we allow further density, like right downtown, Queen Street, basically, in a way that, you have to look at kind of as a gradual transformation. So we're looking at a 6-story building on a side street. It's just off of a main street, but and it's about to come out. It's going to be really controversial. The developer really wants to push it at this scale because it's within walking distance of 3 universities and 5 teaching hospitals. Right. So there's a lot of need for housing in that area.
Yeah.
And so it's 40 units on a lot that used to have a tiny little bungalow. It's a pretty big lot, actually. And it's got a laneway on the side and behind it. So that allows for a lot more windows when you have a laneway. Yeah. And we're also looking at outdoor corridors like the Montreal model, so that you can have through units. So the units have windows on both sides instead of just having windows at one end, which means you have to put your living room and your bedroom and you're kind of cramming everything on the side. You can pull the layout apart and have windows on both sides and cross ventilation. So you can open your windows and have air moving through with kind of these outdoor corridors, right? So we're looking at all these different models for developing livable multi-unit housing.
Yeah, and architects don't do much.
yeah, we're trying.
I mean, that if we just even that alone, that single project, you're talking about solving a problem for 40 people.
Yeah, 40 units.
Right.
And there's a group he's aiming for a much higher proportion of affordable units, only because it's really close to OCAD, right? So he's been speaking with the university to try and find an arrangement of providing these affordable units, which, it's hard to do when it comes to the land values and trying to, what, developers say, pencil out. I love that term. How to make it pencil out. So how do you actually make the performer work where the cost to build?
That's okay. It's part of the built environment.
Yeah, the fire
you hear the sirens in the background? Look, that goes back to what you're saying. Yeah. Access routes for emergency vehicles.
No, so the numbers are really tough in terms of the cost of land, the cost of building today versus the return on investment, right? And in this case, this developer is developing rental units. He's not flipping it and turning around and selling them as condominiums. And so that equation is much more difficult in terms of making the numbers work. So you have to have a certain number of units in there to really make it work in terms of your annual return, because everybody's doing it. Everyone's leveraged, right? Everyone's doing an investment model. So, so that's a really interesting project, and it's about to come out in terms of it's going through a public process for rezoning. And once it goes public, then it really gets put up on all the blogs, and we're expecting a little bit of backlash on the height, but we're not driving the height, obviously, as the developer.
We got to come up with a name for the people that are under the bridge, the ogres.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just to play devil's advocate, I mean, they're well-meaning. It's not, you get the odd people that really just don't want to see any density. They don't understand why we need it. But for the most part, people are doing it for the right reasons. They're looking at, how does this fit in with what we have? How can we densify sustainably and make kind of work with everything that's there already? You don't want to have one building overshadowing everything else, but then you think, okay, if that is going to be the model that we have down the whole street, then how does it work in terms of shadowing? So, I mean, I think that people are thinking about all of those things, and not everybody is a complete NIMBY.
Right. I want to ask you, because we've covered so much. I want to ask you, what is family life like for you? You're talking about helping all these people and all their families. What about yours?
Well, my husband is my partner in life and business. He's our director of business development. And so we have all of our eggs in one basket, as we like to say. Yeah. We're, life is work, work is life. For me, that's a really positive thing. We are basically together 24/7, which is working out really well. It can be challenging at times because there's no real space, but it works really well for us. I have two daughters who are going to be scientists. They're both studying science. One of them is super interested in health sciences, and the other one in chemistry and physics. And I discouraged them actually from going into architecture because we didn't need a fifth generation architect in the family. But they were always interested in science, and I work a lot, but we find time to do the things that are important. And I think that they appreciate the fact that that as a leader in the community, that I'm, out a lot at events, and that they look up to me for my role, and, trying to follow in the footsteps of other trailblazers who are trying to make a difference. And that takes a lot of time. But I basically have a strong family and strong daughters who are going to go far in life, I think.
You said something before about what it is to be a woman in the construction industry. And I will say that I think, and I've mentioned that I talk with someone else, also an architect in this industry, all the time about, in many ways, there is somehow the requirement as a female to have to put in that much more work to receive the same level of recognition.
Well, I don't think it's recognition. I think that women, we were talking about this last night. I was at a WLI event, Women's Leadership Initiative with the ULI. And that was one of the topics around the table, just that I think women set themselves to a higher standard almost. Maybe it's self-imposed in terms of what we have to do and what we have to be. But the construction industry in general is pretty challenging for women. I mean, it's way better now than it was when I was a young architect. And I have so many stories of going on the construction site, and that the trades who just weren't used to having a young woman as an architect who was explaining what needed to be done, or pointing out things that weren't done quite right, or how difficult that would be for certain demographic that weren't, brought up with women in those sorts of positions. But I found that at the beginning very challenging. But then I think that, we're all people, and we would start talking and just having conversations about, well, how do you guys think we could solve this problem? Like, that didn't work, or you discover something behind the walls. And we were doing a lot. I was working at KPMB. We're doing a lot of really complicated renovations to university buildings, and the trades appreciated being consulted, and let's figure out this problem together. But I think that at the time, the first reaction was, whoa, look at this young woman, and they didn't seem to want to take me seriously until we started talking, and I knew what I was talking about. I had done all my research and, worked really hard to get my license, and they completely backed down, and we had these really intelligent conversations about solutions. So I think it was more of an approach than anything else, going on the construction site with respect for all the different people who are involved in the process, instead of going on the construction site saying, it's going to be my way or the highway kind of thing. And I was able to gain the respect of all the trades, to the point where I'd be going on the site and they'd be yelling, "Hey, Heather, how are you? Come over here. Come and check this out." They'd be really proud of what they were doing. And it was a different approach completely. And I think it's different now in that, it's been a long time has passed, but I still take the same approach in terms of, my first visit to the site, and recognizing everybody as a person and the value that they bring to the process, and that without their sort of own skill and expertise, the building is not going to turn out properly. Because if you have a bunch of people who are frustrated working in there and they're cutting corners or whatever, so like it's all about working as a team. But I think that this is not just a problem that women have on construction sites. As an architect, even men, a lot of men, young men, or if you maybe don't have like a really outgoing or dominant personality, they're, a little nervous going on the site and having to deal, especially in a large project, with all the different players involved. And oftentimes contractors have really strong personalities, right? So it's one of the things that we're working on in BEAT is giving people, not just women, the tools that they need to be able to have those conversations and have the confidence to manage on the construction site. And we're also looking at developing some sort of document that might be a framework for a code of conduct for construction sites. And the number one thing being respect for everybody involved. And that's something that I think will really start to transform the industry. It's happening already. There's a lot of really amazing construction companies that have their own codes of conduct, and there's certain activities that are not acceptable anymore, anywhere, not just on the construction site, anywhere. But in the past, those things were prevalent. So just developing different support systems for people, men and women, to all be able to work to their best, right? We're all looking for the same end goal, which is, amazing built product, right?
I have to say, when I initially reached out, I was personally very optimistic and excited about the opportunity to be able to talk to you about all of this. So when you eventually said yes, and we made the date work, I've been really anticipating this, and I think that you very much lived up to what I was hoping we would be able to discuss. It has been very enlightening. I really appreciate all the time. I appreciate the enthusiasm and the passion that you have for what you do. I know that the community does too. I know that you're not doing it for any form of validation, but you need to know that even people you don't know appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for taking the time out of what is an incredibly busy schedule and being able to discuss all that we have today. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.